between business and Labour, between the CBI and Labour. And I think the truth is it's an ongoing conversation and a really important one. We share goals. We absolutely share goals. I talked about some of them this morning, about shared prosperity, about fairness alongside business success. And we are, I think, aligned in those goals. But we do have different ideas on some of the policies, and that's the conversation that we need to have, and we look forward to hearing from Jeremy Corbyn on. We want a partnership. We have talked about that, and as I said this morning, that is our question for the Leader of the Opposition this evening. So I'm absolutely delighted to be able to welcome today Jeremy Corbyn to the stage. I think we are entirely set up and ready to go. So can I please welcome to the stage Jeremy Corbyn, Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Carolyn, for that introduction. You became the Director General of the CBI shortly before I became leader of the Labour Party. And since that time, Labour and the CBI have had actually a very constructive and fruitful working relationship, which will no doubt continue in the future as we set a path for a more successful and prosperous society in our country. So it's a pleasure to be here today, addressing you at such a crucial time in our country's politics and national life. And as I think the last gig of the day, I hope you enjoy it. It's a time of huge decisions that could shape the future of our country for a generation. Decisions about our relationship with the European Union, of course, but also about the kind of economy we want to have. When I spoke to your conference last year, I said that even though we were 17 months on from the referendum, the situation was more precarious than ever. Confusion was at the heart of government, creating an unprecedented uncertainty for you as business people and, of course, for those who work for you in enterprises all across the country. If I said the same today, that would count as something of an understatement. Instead of national leadership, we have a government in complete disarray. As soon as the terms of the withdrawal agreement from the European Union were set down on paper, the government began to collapse on itself. And now the Conservative Party is trying to decide whether this crucial moment in our country's history is the right time to have a party leadership election. That the government has mishandled 2 years of negotiations is now hardly a particularly controversial view, subjecting businesses and their workforces to months of uncertainty. So some perhaps hoped that the length of the negotiations might at least be a sign that the government, rather than negotiating with itself, was negotiating with Brussels, was driving an effective and hard bargain to get the best deal for our economy. Now we know the answer. After the events of the past week, many people and many businesses will be confused and very, very anxious. The Prime Minister has negotiated a botched, worst of all worlds deal, which is bad for Britain, leaving the country in an indefinite halfway house without a real say. The withdrawal agreement breaches the Prime Minister's own red lines and doesn't deliver the strong economic settlement the country needs to support jobs and industry. The deal makes no mention of retaining frictionless trade with Europe and offers only minimal protections for workers, consumers, and our natural environment, while hardwiring in further potential restrictions on state aid for industry. Labour has always said that we respect the results of the referendum, but we cannot respect the shambolic way in which this government has bungled these vital negotiations. This is, after all, a deal that was immediately denounced by the Brexit Secretary, who was the one who was supposed to have negotiated it, as well as the Brexit Secretary before that, his predecessor. Labour will vote against the government's deal, and if the government cannot get its central policy through Parliament, then we will demand what I think is the only sensible course of action, and that is a general election to decide who will govern this country in the future. But if we cannot secure a general election, then we have to be clear that all options must remain on the table, including a public vote of some form. Terry Sargent, the chair and CEO of the steel giant ThyssenKrupp in the UK, and I believe a lifelong Conservative voter, recently said the Tories have failed business. They aren't making decisions for business, he said. They're making decisions to prevent an implosion of their own party. The result of this skewed priority is a Brexit deal that is simply not good enough. Rather than ending the uncertainty of the last 2.5 years, the government has negotiated what locks in uncertainty for another 2, 3, 4, or goodness knows how many more years. If a comprehensive future relationship is not agreed by January 2021, which frankly few believe is likely after the experience so far, then those negotiations would have to be put on hold because the focus would inevitably shift from negotiating the future relationship to negotiating an extension of the transition period, meaning another period and further uncertainty. And if the transition period can't be extended, Britain will be locked into a backstop from which it cannot leave without the agreement of the European Union, with no time limit or end point, and no say for this country, sowing the seeds of a backlash in years to come. And that's only the withdrawal agreement. The outline political declaration that was also published last week, which is supposed to signal our future relationship with the European Union after Brexit, runs to a mighty 7 pages. So after 2 whole years, the fruits of the government's efforts to outline our trading future can be set down on just 7 sheets of paper. With no ambition to negotiate a new, comprehensive customs union, no clear plan for a strong deal with the single market, merely a vague commitment to go beyond the baseline of the World Trade Organization. No determination to achieve frictionless trade, or even the Prime Minister's downgraded ambition for trade to be as frictionless as possible, meaning even more uncertainty for the businesses that you represent. And only the scantiest mention of workers' rights, consumers' rights, or environmental protections. After all the speculation about which adjective to use before the word Brexit, hard, soft, clean, red, white, blue, the Prime Minister has taken us into a new one, a blindfold Brexit. A deal designed to get her through the next stage of the process without anyone being able to see where we're heading as a country, which is what we all need to do. It's a leap in the dark, an ill-defined deal with a never-defined end date. A blindfold Brexit followed by further years of botched negotiations on our future relationship with the EU. With most of our leverage already thrown away, it risks seriously damaging British industry and, of course, the wider economy that relates to that. The government is trying to force through this bad deal by threatening us all with chaos and serious damage to our economy of a no-deal outcome. But I believe the Prime Minister knows that no deal isn't a real option. Neither the Cabinet nor Parliament would endorse such an extreme and, frankly, dangerous course. Labour will not countenance a no-deal Brexit. I fully understand why business, which knows how disastrous a no-deal would be, is so concerned at that prospect. And why some might feel under pressure to support any deal, no matter how botched and half-baked, to avoid something worse. But the threat simply isn't realistic. If the government believed no deal was a genuine option, it would have made serious preparations, but it hasn't. Indeed, shortly before he quit, the former Brexit Secretary revealed that he'd only just found out that the UK is particularly reliant on the Dover-Calais crossing, because we are, as he put it, a peculiar geographic entity, by which I think he means we're an island. Well, we're only talking about 10,000 lorries a day arriving at Dover, handling 17% of the country's entire trade in goods, worth an estimated 122 billion last year. The choice between the Prime Minister's deal and no deal is a false choice, designed to scare people into backing the government. So Labour has set out an alternative plan for a sensible, jobs-first agreement that could win support in Parliament and help bring our country together. First, we want a new, comprehensive, permanent customs union with a British say in future trade deals that would ensure no hard border in Northern Ireland and avoid for the government's half-baked backstop deal. Businesses and workers need certainty. The Tories' sticking plaster plan for a temporary customs arrangement with no clarity on how long it will last and no British say can only prolong uncertainty and put jobs and prosperity at risk. Second, a sensible deal needs a guarantee of a strong single market relationship. Talk of settling for a downgraded Canada-style arrangement is an option popular only on the extremes of the Conservative Party. It would be a risk to our economy, jobs, and investment in our schools, our hospitals, and all of our vital public services. Third, a deal that works for Britain must also guarantee that our country does not fall behind the European Union in workers' rights or protections for consumers and the environment, which should be a world leader. Our country should be a world leader in rights and standards. We won't let this happen. We won't let this Conservative government use Brexit as an excuse for a race to the bottom in protections, to rip up rights at work, or to expose our children to chlorinated chicken by running down our product standards. A good Brexit plan for this country is not just about what can be negotiated with Brussels. It must also include a radical programme of investment and real change across all of the regions of Britain and the nations that make up the UK. Brexit should be the catalyst to invest in our regions and infrastructure, bringing good jobs and real control to local communities and people. If the Prime Minister is unable to negotiate an agreement that can win a majority in Parliament and work for the whole country, Labour's alternative plan can, and I believe must, take its place. The deal I've outlined has always been possible, putting the economy and jobs first, as both Labour and indeed the CBI have argued in different ways for some time. In January, Caroline called for the UK to remain in a customs union with the EU for the long term. And we agree with the CBI too on the need for a deal that guarantees a strong single market relationship. There is a better deal to be had, and it's not too late to achieve it if the government has the courage to change course or stand aside and let an election take place. The responsibility for how we got to this point certainly lies with the government, both in Downing Street and in the predecessor incumbent to Downing Street as well. But there is a bigger story to tell. In 2016, the country voted to leave the European Union against an economic backdrop of post-crash Britain, 1 million families using food banks, 4 million children living in poverty, and real wages that are lower today than they were in 2010. In towns and cities hollowed out by industrial decline and neglect, with boarded up shops, closed youth centres, many people voted for Brexit as an act of protest against a political system that simply was not delivering for them. At the root of this was Britain's profoundly unbalanced economy, chronic underinvestment and failed economic policy. That needs to change. The shape of our economy after Brexit will not only be determined by the text negotiated in Brussels, it will be driven by political decisions about the direction we wish to take for this country. We could try to carry on as before, with economic thinking that has fueled instability, insecurity, and brought about crisis. Or we can embrace change and build a more equal and more prosperous society that meets people's hopes and needs. So today, I not only want to talk about getting a good deal with the EU, but about getting a good deal for all of our country's people. You may be working for a big company, struggling with increasing personal debt, striving to meet excessive rent or mortgage payments. You may alternatively be running a small business, scraping by week to week, awaiting payments to come in to cover ever-rising overheads. You may be employed in the public sector, having barely seen a pay rise in 10 years, but working harder than ever as many of your colleagues have lost their jobs and you're covering for them. Or you may be surviving in the precarious economy as 1 in every 9 working people now are, maybe getting paid the minimum wage on a 0-hours contract, instantly sackable, never knowing for sure whether you'll have work from one day to the next. When people such as these think about the economy, of course they're asking, what's in it for me? Household debt is rising, rent rising, utility bills rising, while the public services we all rely on are shrinking in terms of what they can provide. Social care, the National Health Service, and all of our children's education. Last week, and it was almost unnoticed amid the drama of cabinet resignations, Professor Philip Alston, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, published a damning report on poverty in the UK. He found that a fifth of the population, amounting to 14 million people, are living in poverty. He catalogued what he described as the dramatic decline in the fortunes of the least well-off, and said our rates of child poverty, and I quote, are not just a disgrace, but a social calamity and an economic disaster. The fact is that wealth hasn't trickled down. Instead, rigid and outdated economic thinking has helped create a situation where 20% of Britain's wealth is in the hands of just 1% of the population, making us one of the most unequal countries in the European Union. Inflated boardroom bonuses haven't made our economy stronger or more successful. Corporation tax cuts haven't increased investment and growth or put more money into pay packets. And financial deregulation didn't deliver self-regulating markets, but an era-defining economic crash from which we are still struggling to recover. It could not be clearer. Business as usual is not working. And when the rules of the game aren't working for the overwhelming majority, the rules of the game need to change. That means a new settlement for business and a stronger say for the workforce, where government will drive a higher rate of investment in infrastructure, education, skills, and the technologies, the exciting new technologies of the future. And the largest businesses that can afford it will pay a little bit more towards the common good from which we will all benefit. So, we will repeal the 2016 Trade Union Act and roll out sectoral collective bargaining to ensure working people can be fairly represented through their unions. And at the Labour Party annual conference in September, we set out a proposal to give workers a say and a stake in larger businesses. We'll legislate to ensure a third of the seats on company boards are reserved for elected worker directors, and we'll give employees a stake in company profits by asking big businesses to transfer shares to be held by workers in trust. Despite the frenzied reaction in certain sections of the press, there certainly isn't any kind of war on business. Actually, it's rather the opposite. We recognise the vast and vital contribution businesses make to our economy and our society. And at the heart of that contribution are your employees. They have an interest in the long-term success of your company because it's their company as well. They have that in-depth institutional knowledge of its day-to-day workings. They have so much to contribute, and giving them a real voice will actually strengthen, not weaken, business. Workers create profits. Giving workers a share in them isn't just fair, it's actually good for business. We believe our plans are necessary not just to create a fairer economy that can command public legitimacy, but to rebuild our economy for the 21st century and raise productivity and investment in every region, nation, and community, particularly those communities that feel so left behind in many parts of Britain. We share an understanding of the urgent need to increase public investment in the economy. And if the public is going to invest on the scale needed, then people need to feel they have a real say over their own economic future. The UK is the only major economy where investment is falling, not rising. That's holding back our economy, our innovation, and actually our productivity. The failure to invest means Britain's productivity is 15% lower than that of other major economies. So a future Labour government will develop a comprehensive industrial strategy to rebalance our economy, reduce our reliance on the financial sector centred in London and the South East, and increase prosperity in every region and nation of the UK. We'll follow the example of Germany and Canada in establishing a national investment bank and a network of regional development banks. These will provide $250 billion of private lending capital to emerging businesses and cooperatives across the country, getting the money to where it is needed and filling the gaps in lending that have been left by private banks. But as well as the lending gap, we're also determined to close the skills gap. We will create a national education service to provide both vocational and academic training to anyone who wants it throughout their life. It's the best way to ensure people are equipped with the skills they need to flourish. Because education doesn't just benefit the individual who receives it. It benefits the economy, it benefits the whole society, it benefits all of us. We recognise that to close the skills gap, we cannot close ourselves off from the rest of the world. So when others, Tories, talk about high-skilled immigration, what they actually mean is high-wage immigration. That won't solve the shortage of nurses, care workers and builders who desperately need and are vital to rebuilding an economy that works for all. Many sectors, agriculture and others, are very, very concerned about what is happening to them in the future. There is nothing to gain from false competition between good and bad migration, which only whips up division and hatred. Having seen the consequence of this government's hostile environment with the Windrush scandal, few will be convinced that this government is capable of delivering either a fair or efficient migration system. Britain's infrastructure, roads, railways, telecommunications, desperately need upgrade, which is why Labour is also planning to create a national transformation fund. This will provide a further $250 billion, making sure we have the infrastructure we need to achieve our potential. We've been talking a lot today about the urgency and importance of choices we face over Brexit. But in a very real sense, the most serious and pressing challenge we face of all, for all of us, is the potential decimation of our planet. That's why, in response to many reports over many years and the recent IPCC report, our policy to aim for 60% of heat and electricity to come from low carbon or renewable sources by 2030 and to achieve net zero emission before 2050 is, I think, the right one. The Conservative government has overseen a 56% fall in investment in renewable energy over the last year. Our government will put environment centre stage. That doesn't have to mean sacrifice. It's actually a huge opportunity for businesses, jobs and communities. We will create 400,000 high-skilled, well-paid green jobs, cutting emissions and generating employment at the same time by increasing the production of offshore wind power sevenfold, doubling onshore wind power, trebling solar power and launching a £12 billion fund for home insulation. These are, I concede, bold plans, but they are necessary if we're to meet the climate crisis head on, which will not spare any of us, it will affect every single one of us, and upgrade our economy at the same time for the 21st century. To tackle the greatest challenges facing our country today, we shouldn't fear change, we should embrace it. Deep-seated change is needed to avoid a damaging Brexit that will hurt enterprise, jobs and living standards, and instead use it as a catalyst for economic transformation. Change is needed to prevent the destruction of our environment that endangers all of our futures and all of our children's futures. And change is needed to tackle the huge inequality that has distorted the economy and in so many ways fractured our society. A senior figure in public life recently warned, an economy in which the returns to capital are greater than the returns to labour is one in which support for capitalism is going to decline. No, that's not a quote from John McDonnell or anybody else in the shadow cabinet. They're the words of former Conservative Chancellor George Osborne. And he was absolutely right. Businesses in Britain today face a great future if they embrace the changes we need for our economy and our society. We're ready to lead that change, and I invite you to join us to make that change together, to rebuild our economy for our country, so it really does work for the many, really does work for everybody, not just for a few people. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. It's a real pleasure to be present with you.